Imagine a world unlike anything we recognize today. A world whose memory survives only in fragments, whispers preserved in ancient texts hidden away for millennia. It is a world said to have existed before the Great Flood, a civilization both luminous and dangerous, where humanity stood at the crossroads of divine knowledge and moral responsibility. The Dead Sea Scrolls, unearthed from the caves of Qumran in the mid-20th century, pull back the veil on this forgotten age, offering unsettling glimpses into a time when humans were not merely primitive ancestors struggling for survival, but participants in a grand experiment of knowledge, power, and consequence. These writings do not simply recount religious traditions. They hint at a lost world whose sophistication challenges everything modern history assumes about humanity's earliest chapters, from the moment the scrolls were discovered. Scholars realized they contained more than familiar biblical passages. Alongside known scriptures were mysterious texts that expanded, reframed, and sometimes outright challenged conventional narratives. Within these writings are echoes of a pre-flood civilization shaped by profound spiritual awareness, advanced understanding of the natural world, and interactions with beings described as the sons of God. These figures, often identified as the Watchers, are said to have walked among humanity, imparting extraordinary knowledge that forever altered the course of human development. The Dead Sea Scrolls lies precisely here, in their suggestion that the ancient world was not merely a precursor to civilization, but a peak from which humanity fell. The scrolls present history not as a simple, linear progression from ignorance to enlightenment, but as a cycle of ascent, corruption, and collapse. In their verses, humanity is portrayed as deeply engaged with cosmic order, ethical law, and scientific observation. Far from living in isolation from the forces of nature, pre-flood societies are depicted as attuned to celestial cycles, environmental balance, and moral causality. This was a world in which knowledge was sacred, powerful, and perilous, capable of elevating civilization or destroying it entirely. At the heart of these narratives is the idea that knowledge itself is never neutral. The Watchers, celestial beings who descended to Earth, are said to have taught humans astronomy, metallurgy, agriculture, medicine, and the hidden workings of the natural world. These gifts transformed human society, accelerating development in ways that seem astonishing even by modern standards. The scrolls suggest that humanity learned to read the stars, harness the Earth's resources, heal the body, and reshape the landscape. Cities rose, technologies advanced, and human ambition soared. Yet woven through these achievements is a persistent warning. Wisdom without ethical restraint leads inevitably to corruption. The Dead Sea Scrolls do not romanticize this ancient world. Instead, they present it as a place of profound tension, where spiritual insight coexisted with moral failure. Humanity stood closer to the divine than ever before, yet that proximity magnified the consequences of human choice. The texts speak of societies organized around laws and rituals designed to maintain harmony between the human, natural, and divine realms. Ethical conduct was not an abstract ideal, but a practical necessity, understood as the foundation of social stability and cosmic balance. When these principles were honored, civilization flourished. When they were ignored, the very fabric of existence began to unravel. One of the most striking aspects of the scrolls is their portrayal of human consciousness. Pre-flood people are depicted as possessing a heightened awareness of time, cycles, and consequence. They understood history as movement within a larger cosmic rhythm, where actions echoed across generations. This awareness shaped their institutions, their rituals, and their understanding of leadership. Authority was not merely political but moral, and leaders were expected to embody wisdom, restraint, and accountability. The failure of leadership, according to the scrolls, was not just a social problem, but a spiritual catastrophe that destabilized the entire world. The Book of Giants, preserved in fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls, deepens this portrait of pre-flood life. It introduces beings of immense stature and influence, figures who symbolize the amplification of human potential when infused with extraordinary knowledge. These giants are not presented as simple monsters, but as complex individuals, capable of brilliance and destruction alike. They are builders, thinkers, and innovators, shaping their world with skill and vision. Yet they are also deeply flawed, prone to excess, violence, and ethical blindness. Through their stories, the scrolls explore the dangers of unchecked power and the fragile line between greatness and ruin. Archaeological evidence, though incomplete, offers intriguing parallels to these narratives. Ancient tools, architectural remnants, and unexplained engineering feats suggest that early human societies may have possessed technical capabilities far beyond what is typically attributed to them. When read alongside the Dead Sea Scrolls, these discoveries take on new meaning. They hint at a lost continuity of knowledge, disrupted by catastrophe and only partially recovered in later civilizations. The scrolls seem to preserve memory rather than invention, recording what was once known rather than imagining what might have been. Astronomy occupies a central place in the scroll's depiction of pre-flood civilization. The texts describe careful observation of the heavens, tracking the movements of the sun, moon, and stars with remarkable precision. These observations were not merely academic. They structured agricultural cycles, religious festivals, and social organization. The cosmos was understood as a system of order reflecting divine law, and to study it was to participate in that order. Knowledge of the stars carried moral weight, reinforcing the idea that understanding the universe required humility and responsibility. This integration of science and spirituality distinguishes the pre-flood world described. In the scrolls from modern conceptions of ancient life, there was no sharp division between empirical observation and ethical reflection. Medicine was not only about healing the body, but about restoring harmony. Agriculture was not merely production, but stewardship of the land. Architecture was not just construction, but expression of cosmic and communal order. Every domain of knowledge was embedded within a moral framework, reminding humanity that mastery over nature demanded reverence rather than domination. Yet the scrolls repeatedly return to the theme of misuse. The knowledge given by the Watchers, while transformative, was not always applied with wisdom. Metallurgy, for example, enabled both craftsmanship and weaponry. Astronomy could guide planting or justify power through divination. Medicine could heal or manipulate. The text suggests that as knowledge spread, ethical discipline weakened. Ambition eclipsed restraint, and innovation outpaced moral development. This imbalance, the scrolls imply, was the true seed of catastrophe. Spiritual life in the pre-flood world was rich and demanding. The scrolls describe rituals of purification, prayer, and meditation designed to align individuals with divine principles. These practices were not escapist but integrative, grounding daily life in ethical awareness. Community cohesion was emphasized, with shared responsibility for maintaining moral order. Education was structured and deliberate, passing knowledge through trusted lineages and initiatory systems. Wisdom was something to be earned, not consumed indiscriminately. Longevity plays a symbolic role in these narratives. Figures described as living hundreds of years are portrayed as repositories of accumulated wisdom and experience. Their long lives allowed them to witness cycles of growth and decline, to teach multiple generations, and to serve as moral anchors within society. Whether understood literally or symbolically, these extended lifespans underscore the scroll's emphasis on continuity, responsibility, and the long-term consequences of human action. Life was not measured merely in years, but in contribution and ethical integrity. Environmental awareness permeates the scroll's vision of pre-flood life. Humanity is depicted as acutely conscious of its impact on the natural world. Certain passages describe imbalance, disruption, and decay, hinting at ecological crises born of excess and neglect. These warnings are framed not as abstract prophecies, but as observations rooted in lived experience. The pre-flood world understood that environmental harmony was inseparable from moral order, and that violation of one inevitably damaged the other. The interactions between humans and celestial beings further complicate this picture. The Watchers are not portrayed as purely benevolent or malicious, but as catalysts whose presence intensified human potential and vulnerability. Their descent introduced knowledge that humanity was not fully prepared to wield. The scrolls emphasize that guidance does not override free will. Humans remained responsible for how they applied what they learned. This insistence on accountability runs throughout the texts, reinforcing the idea that destiny is shaped not by gifts alone, but by choices. Social organization in the pre-flood world appears sophisticated and intentional. The scrolls reference councils, laws, and communal decision-making processes designed to balance authority and justice. There's a clear concern for equity, ethical governance, and collective welfare. Even when describing corruption or conflict, the texts frame these events as deviations from established moral norms, rather than inevitable conditions of human nature. Civilization, in this view, was meant to function as a moral ecosystem, sustained by shared values and mutual responsibility. The language of the Dead Sea Scrolls enhances their enigmatic power. Rich in symbolism and poetic imagery, the texts blur the boundary between history and myth, inviting interpretation without surrendering meaning. Giants, angels, and ancient cities serve as both literal figures and metaphors for human aspiration and excess. This layered storytelling allows the scrolls to operate simultaneously as historical memory, moral instruction, and spiritual reflection. As we move deeper into these writings, it becomes increasingly clear that the pre-flood world was neither a utopia nor a cautionary fantasy. It was a complex civilization grappling with questions that remain deeply familiar: how to balance innovation with ethics, power with humility, knowledge with wisdom. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserve not just the memory of what was lost, but the reasons for that loss, framing catastrophe as the culmination of long-ignored warnings rather than sudden divine wrath. The Great Flood, though still distant in the narrative at this stage, looms as an unspoken consequence. The scrolls build toward it gradually, tracing patterns of moral erosion, environmental imbalance, and social fragmentation. They suggest that collapse was not inevitable, but the result of choices made repeatedly and collectively. This slow unfolding underscores one of the scrolls' most unsettling messages: that the end of a civilization often arrives not with surprise, but with tragic predictability. What emerges from this first exploration is a vision of humanity at its most capable and most vulnerable. The pre-flood civilization described in the Dead Sea Scrolls possessed knowledge that rivaled later achievements, yet lacked the ethical cohesion to sustain it indefinitely. Their story is not one of ignorance punished, but of wisdom mishandled. It is a narrative that challenges modern assumptions about progress, suggesting that advancement alone does not guarantee survival. Central to this instability is the figure of the Watchers, the celestial beings whose descent marked a turning point in human history. According to the texts, they were not distant gods, but active participants in human affairs, teachers who crossed the boundary between the divine and the earthly. They revealed the hidden structures of reality, unveiling the laws that governed nature, the body, and the heavens. Humans learned to smelt metals, shape tools with precision, cultivate crops with scientific awareness, and treat illness with methods grounded in observation and experimentation. These teachings accelerated human progress so dramatically that the pre-flood world began to resemble a civilization far removed from primitive survival. Yet the scrolls emphasize that this knowledge was never intended to be value neutral. It came with expectations of restraint, humility, and reverence for the order it revealed. The Watchers themselves, however, were not immune to transgression. Some texts imply that they violated the very laws they were meant to uphold, forming improper attachments to humanity and disrupting the balance between realms. This breach of order echoed downward, magnifying ethical confusion among humans and blurring the boundaries that had once anchored moral clarity. The Book of Giants expands on the consequences of this disruption through vivid narratives, centered on beings born of this union between the celestial and the human. These giants are described as towering figures of immense capability, endowed with strength, intellect, and influence beyond ordinary measure. They became leaders, innovators, and symbols of a new era, shaping cities and institutions according to their vision. Their presence altered the social hierarchy, concentrating power in unprecedented ways and redefining what authority meant in a world infused with extraordinary knowledge. At first, the giants' achievements appeared to validate the promise of the Watcher's teachings. Architectural feats rose across the landscape, structures designed with mathematical precision and symbolic alignment to celestial patterns. Agriculture flourished under systematic planning informed by astronomical observation. Medicine evolved from ritual practice into a disciplined art grounded in empirical insight. Society seemed poised on the brink of a golden age, one where human ingenuity could finally harmonize with the forces of nature and the cosmos. But beneath this surface of advancement, the scrolls traced the slow corrosion of ethical restraint. Power began to distort purpose. The giants, once celebrated as stewards of knowledge, increasingly acted as masters rather than guardians. Their influence fostered inequality, as access to advanced knowledge and resources became unevenly distributed. The scrolls describe a widening gap between those who wielded power and those who lived under its consequences, a division that eroded communal trust and social cohesion. Violence, once restrained by shared moral codes, grew more frequent and more devastating as metallurgy and engineering were repurposed for domination. Weapons became more efficient, conflicts more destructive. The same knowledge that could cultivate abundance was redirected toward conquest and control. The scrolls do not portray this shift as sudden or inevitable. Instead, they emphasize its gradual nature, shaped by countless decisions that prioritized ambition over responsibility. Astronomical knowledge, one of the most revered sciences of the pre-flood world, also became a source of tension. Originally cultivated to understand seasonal cycles and cosmic order, it increasingly served as a tool for divination and political authority. Those who claimed mastery of the heavens asserted influence over communal decisions, justifying their power through interpretations of celestial signs. In this way, the stars, once symbols of universal balance, became instruments of social manipulation, further destabilizing ethical norms. The scrolls reveal that spiritual life, too, suffered under these pressures. Rituals meant to foster humility and alignment with divine principles were distorted into displays of power and exclusivity. Sacred knowledge was hoarded, restricted not for ethical preparation, but for control. The initiatory systems that once ensured responsible transmission of wisdom became mechanisms of hierarchy, reinforcing divisions rather than nurturing communal integrity. This corruption of spiritual practice signaled a deeper rupture between intention and action, between knowledge and wisdom. Environmental imbalance emerges as another critical theme during this period. The scrolls describe landscapes altered by human excess, forests diminished, waters disrupted, and fertile lands strained by overexploitation. These descriptions, often framed in poetic language, suggest a growing awareness that human activity was pushing natural systems beyond their limits. The pre-flood people understood these signs not merely as environmental problems, but as moral indicators, reflections of a deeper misalignment between humanity and the order of creation. Longevity, once a symbol of wisdom and continuity, took on a more ambiguous meaning. Elders who had lived through generations of change struggled to guide societies increasingly driven by speed, innovation, and ambition. Their accumulated insight was often ignored or overshadowed by the allure of new techniques and immediate gains. The scrolls suggest a tragic irony. Those most capable of recognizing the dangers ahead were gradually marginalized, their voices drowned out by the momentum of progress, untempered by foresight. The watchers themselves occupy a complex moral position in these texts. While they are held accountable for introducing forbidden knowledge, the scrolls do not absolve humanity of responsibility. Humans are repeatedly portrayed as active agents, choosing how to apply what they had learned. This insistence on free will underscores one of the scroll's most enduring messages, that even divinely revealed knowledge cannot substitute for ethical discernment. Guidance can illuminate possibilities, but it cannot compel virtue. Social structures continued to grow more elaborate as the pre-flood era progressed. Councils, legal systems, and administrative institutions expanded to manage increasingly complex societies. On the surface, these developments suggested stability and sophistication. Yet the scrolls hint at an underlying brittleness, as laws multiplied to address symptoms rather than causes. Justice became procedural rather than moral, focused on maintaining order rather than cultivating virtue. This shift marked a profound transformation in how society understood responsibility and accountability. The giants' narratives illustrate this transformation with particular force. Once embodiments of human potential, they gradually became symbols of excess and imbalance. Their dreams, recorded in fragmented passages, reveal anxiety and foreboding, visions of impending judgment and loss. These dreams suggest an awareness, even among the most powerful, that something fundamental had gone wrong. The scrolls portray these moments not as sudden revelations, but as the culmination of long-suppressed doubts, surfacing when it was already too late to reverse course. As corruption spread, the boundaries between human and divine order continued to erode. The scrolls describe a world in which violence, exploitation, and injustice became normalized, woven into the fabric of daily life. What had once been considered transgressions were rationalized as necessities of progress or expressions of strength. This moral numbing, more than any single act, is presented as the true tragedy of the pre-flood world, the gradual loss of the ability to recognize wrongdoing as wrongdoing. The texts also emphasize secrecy during this period, not as a protective measure, but as a symptom of fear and control. Knowledge that once flowed through structured mentorship was hidden behind walls of privilege and power. This secrecy bred suspicion, undermining communal trust and amplifying social fragmentation. The scroll suggests that when wisdom becomes a commodity rather than a shared responsibility, it accelerates societal decay. Despite this bleak trajectory, the scrolls do not depict the pre-flood world as devoid of resistance or hope. Scattered throughout the texts are references to individuals and communities who sought to preserve ethical integrity amid widespread corruption. These figures are often portrayed as quiet, steadfast, and marginalized, committed to living in accordance with divine principles, even as society drifted away from them. Their presence reinforces the idea that collapse was not universal or unanimous, but contested and deeply tragic. Astronomical imagery intensifies as the narrative approaches its turning point. The heavens, once symbols of harmony, are described as witnesses to human failure. Celestial cycles continue with unwavering precision, contrasting sharply with the disorder unfolding on Earth. This juxtaposition underscores the scroll's moral framework. The universe remains ordered, but humanity has fallen out of alignment with it. The resulting tension sets the stage for the catastrophe to come. Environmental signs grow more ominous in these later passages. Flood imagery appears not yet as an event, but as a metaphor. Waters rising symbolically through descriptions of chaos, instability, and dissolution. The scrolls imply that the natural world itself was responding to human imbalance, not as an act of vengeance, but as a consequence of disrupted harmony. This portrayal reinforces the idea that ethical failure has tangible effects, rippling outward through ecological and cosmic systems. The Watcher's fate, hinted at in fragmented verses, reflects the gravity of this moment. They are depicted as bound, judged, or removed from influence, signaling an attempt to restore cosmic order. Yet their withdrawal does not immediately heal the damage already done. Humanity must still confront the consequences of its choices, underscoring the scroll's insistence that responsibility cannot be outsourced, even to divine intermediaries. As the pre-flood era nears its end, the scrolls convey a sense of inevitability shaped by accumulated failure rather than sudden decree. Civilization, once vibrant and promising, now appears exhausted, strained under the weight of its contradictions. Knowledge has outpaced wisdom, power has eclipsed responsibility, and ambition has undermined community. The world stands at a threshold, aware on some level of what is coming, yet largely incapable of changing course. As the final phase of the pre-flood narrative unfolds within the Dead Sea Scrolls, the tone shifts from warning to reckoning. The world they describe is no longer merely unstable but profoundly misaligned, a civilization standing on the edge of dissolution while still clinging to the illusion of permanence. Knowledge continues to circulate, rituals persist, and institutions remain intact on the surface, yet beneath this structure lies a hollowed core. The scrolls convey a sense that the pre-flood world had exhausted its moral reserves, having drawn too heavily on power without replenishing wisdom, on innovation without renewing responsibility. Human longevity, once a stabilizing force, now underscores the tragedy of this moment. Elders who had witnessed centuries of cultural evolution carried within them the memory of what society had once been and what it might have remained. They remembered a time when knowledge was tempered by humility, when learning unfolded slowly through ethical preparation, and when leadership was measured by service rather than dominance. Yet these figures increasingly appear isolated in the texts, their counsel overshadowed by younger generations intoxicated by capability and speed. The scrolls suggest that long life alone could not preserve civilization. Wisdom had to be actively chosen, transmitted, and embodied. The interaction between humanity and celestial order becomes increasingly symbolic as the narrative progresses. Astronomical references take on a somber resonance, with the heavens depicted as unwavering in their precision, while human society drifts further into disorder. The stars continue their cycles, the seasons turn, and cosmic law remains intact, highlighting by contrast the extent of human deviation. This juxtaposition reinforces one of the scroll's central insights, that moral collapse is not mirrored by chaos in the universe, but rather by humanity's growing inability to live in alignment with an already ordered reality. The Watchers, whose teachings once accelerated human ascent, recede fully from the stage at this point in the story. Their binding or removal, hinted at in fragmented passages, is portrayed as an attempt to halt further damage rather than reverse what has already occurred. The scrolls are clear that their absence does not absolve humanity. The knowledge they imparted remains embedded in society, shaping tools, institutions, and ambitions. What matters now is not the origin of that knowledge, but how it has been used and misused over time. Environmental imagery grows more explicit and foreboding. Waters, once symbols of life and renewal, become metaphors for instability and overwhelm. Rivers overflow their bounds in poetic descriptions. Lands lose their fertility, and natural rhythms are disrupted. These passages suggest that ecological imbalance had reached a critical point, reflecting the cumulative effects of human excess. The scrolls frame this not as an arbitrary punishment, but as an organic consequence, the natural world responding to sustained disregard for its limits. Humanity's failure to steward creation ethically is shown to reverberate through every layer of existence, Social cohesion, already weakened, fractures further under these pressures. The scrolls depict communities divided by power, access to knowledge, and competing interpretations of meaning. Justice, once rooted in shared ethical vision, becomes increasingly procedural and coercive. Laws are enforced without wisdom, rituals performed without sincerity, and authority exercised without accountability. This hollowing of social institutions is one of the most striking features of the pre-flood collapse, illustrating how structures can persist long after the values that gave them life have eroded. The giants' final portrayals are particularly poignant. Once embodiments of amplified human potential, they now appear restless and burdened, haunted by dreams that foreshadow destruction. These visions are filled with symbolic language, crumbling foundations, rising waters, and silenced voices, reflecting an intuitive awareness that the world they helped shape cannot endure. The scrolls do not depict their end as triumphant justice or simple annihilation, but as tragic consequence, the inevitable result of power divorced from ethical grounding. Despite the pervasive decline, the scrolls preserve traces of resistance and hope. Small communities and individuals continue to uphold principles of restraint, humility, and reverence for divine order. They are often described in understated terms, emphasizing faithfulness over influence. These figures do not reverse the course of civilization, but they ensure that wisdom is not entirely extinguished. Their role is not to save the pre-flood world, but to carry forward its lessons, safeguarding fragments of insight that might guide a future shaped by catastrophe. The approach of the great flood is conveyed with restraint rather than spectacle. The scrolls do not dwell on dramatic destruction, but on moral culmination. The flood emerges as the final expression of imbalance long in the making, the outward manifestation of an inward collapse. By the time it arrives, the world described in the text is already broken in essential ways. The catastrophe does not so much end a thriving civilization as bring closure to one that has lost its capacity for renewal. In framing the flood this way, the Dead Sea Scrolls shift the focus from divine wrath to human responsibility. The catastrophe is not arbitrary, nor is it solely imposed from beyond. It is presented as the inevitable outcome of choices made repeatedly across generations, choices that prioritized power over wisdom and ambition over care. This framing transforms the flood from a singular event into a moral lesson, one that resonates far beyond its ancient setting. The preservation of knowledge becomes a crucial theme at this juncture. Certain teachings, texts, and ethical principles are deliberately concealed, entrusted to those deemed capable of honoring their weight. This act of preservation is portrayed as an expression of hope rather than fear. The scrolls suggest that while civilizations may fall, wisdom can endure if it is protected with discernment. The survival of these teachings ensures that humanity's story does not begin again from nothing, but from reflection. As the flood narrative recedes into memory, the scrolls invite readers to consider the cyclical nature of history. Rise and collapse are not anomalies but recurring patterns, shaped by how societies manage the relationship between knowledge and responsibility. The pre-flood world is presented as a mirror, reflecting both humanity's highest aspirations and its most destructive tendencies. Its story challenges the assumption that progress is linear or guaranteed, emphasizing instead the fragile balance that sustains civilization. The ethical framework woven throughout the scrolls becomes especially clear in their closing reflections. Knowledge is celebrated as a sacred gift, capable of illuminating reality and expanding human potential. Yet it is also portrayed as a test, revealing the character of those who wield it. Power amplifies intention, making virtue more impactful and vice more destructive. Without ethical cultivation, even the most advanced understanding becomes a catalyst for harm. The Dead Sea Scrolls ultimately position the pre-flood civilization not as a mythic curiosity, but as a warning encoded in narrative and symbol. They suggest that humanity has faced existential crossroads before, and that the outcomes of those moments were shaped not by technological limits, but by moral choices. The ancient world they describe was advanced in ways both familiar and unsettling, grappling with dilemmas that echo unmistakably in the modern age. As the narrative draws to a close, the scrolls extend their message beyond history into reflection. They ask what it means to inherit knowledge without inheriting wisdom, to command power without cultivating restraint. They challenge readers to consider how societies define progress, how they educate future generations, and how they balance innovation with care for the natural and social worlds that sustain them. The pre-flood story becomes less about what was lost and more about what must be remembered. In this sense, the Dead Sea Scrolls are not relics frozen in time, but living texts that speak across millennia. They preserve the memory of a civilization that reached extraordinary heights and fell not because it knew too little, but because it failed to live up to what it knew. The flood marks an ending, but also a beginning, a clearing of ground upon which new societies would rise, carrying within them faint echoes of ancient insight. The enduring power of these texts lies in their insistence that history is not merely a record of events, but a repository of lessons. The pre-flood world stands as a testament to humanity's capacity for brilliance and blindness alike. Its achievements inspire awe, while its collapse demands humility. The scrolls do not offer simple answers or comforting conclusions. Instead, they invite sustained contemplation of the relationship between knowledge, ethics, and survival. Ultimately, the story preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls functions as both memory and mirror. It reminds us that civilizations are judged not only by what they build, but by how they live, not only by what they discover, but by how they apply that discovery. The lost pre-flood world, hidden for centuries in fragile fragments of parchment, speaks with renewed urgency in an age once again defined by unprecedented knowledge and power. The warning embedded in these ancient texts is neither despairing nor naive. It acknowledges human fallibility while affirming the possibility of wisdom. It suggests that catastrophe is not fate, but consequence, and that the future remains open to those willing to learn from the past. In preserving the story of a civilization that rose, overreached, and fell, the Dead Sea Scrolls offer humanity a rare gift, the chance to recognize itself in a forgotten world, and to choose, with clearer eyes, a different path forward. This is why the Dead Sea Scrolls matter today. They are not simply ancient manuscripts or theological curiosities, but profound reflections on the human condition. They challenge modern civilization to confront its own relationship with power, knowledge, and responsibility. They remind us that progress without ethics is fragile, and that wisdom, once lost, must be painfully relevant. In the end, the lost pre-flood civilization is not truly lost at all. It survives in these texts as a cautionary echo, a reminder carved into history itself. Whether humanity heeds that warning remains an open question. But the message endures. Knowledge can elevate or destroy. Power can serve or corrupt. And the fate of civilization is shaped not by what we know, but by how we choose to live with what we know.